When the first cargoes linked to Egypt's green hydrogen build-out began moving toward export markets, the story was quickly framed as a geopolitical milestone. A sun-rich country at the crossroads of global shipping had finally entered the clean fuel trade. Europe was short on molecules. The United States was signaling interest in diversified supply, and Egypt appeared ready to step into the gap. But beneath the headlines, this moment is not primarily about diplomacy or symbolism. It is about whether a complex, capital-intensive system can convert renewable electricity into exportable hydrogen at a price and reliability profile that survives real-world stress. The outcome will not be decided by announcements. It will be decided by the interaction of infrastructure, timing, contracts, shipping physics, and capital discipline. Egypt's green hydrogen push is emerging from a specific geographic and economic logic. The country sits adjacent to the Suez Canal, one of the most critical maritime choke points on Earth, and it has access to large tracts of high-quality solar and wind resources. In theory, that combination allows Egypt to do something few regions can: generate renewable power at scale, convert it into hydrogen or ammonia, and ship it efficiently to demand centers in Europe and potentially the United States. In practice, however, each of those steps introduces friction. The story of Egypt's exports is therefore not a clean narrative of success, but a test case for whether hydrogen can move from industrial concept to bankable export commodity. The first exports matter because they break a psychological barrier. For years, green hydrogen has lived in feasibility studies and policy roadmaps. Projects were announced, memoranda signed, strategies launched, but molecules rarely moved. Egypt's shipments, even at partial scale, demonstrate that the conversion chain can be physically assembled. Renewable power feeding electrolyzers, hydrogen transformed into ammonia, ammonia loaded onto ships and cargoes delivered to overseas buyers. This alone does not prove competitiveness, but it does shift the conversation from possibility to performance. Once molecules move, scrutiny intensifies. Costs become visible. Delays show up. Weak links can no longer hide behind future promises. At the heart of the system is electricity. Egypt's advantage begins with renewable resource quality, not electrolyzer technology. High solar irradiance and strong wind corridors mean higher capacity factors, which directly influence hydrogen cost. But electricity abundance does not automatically translate into usable power for electrolysis. Grid connections, curtailment risk, and power management become decisive. Dedicated renewable plants can shield electrolyzers from grid congestion, but they raise capital requirements and complexity. Hybrid configurations that combine grid and captive supply reduce intermittency, but introduce exposure to power pricing and availability. The system must decide whether it is optimized for theoretical minimum cost or for operational reliability under stress. Electrolyzers sit downstream of these decisions. Their performance, degradation rates, and operating flexibility affect output, but they are rarely the dominant cost driver in export projects. Balance of plant, water treatment, compression, conversion to ammonia, storage, and loading infrastructure often eclipse stack costs. In Egypt's case, access to industrial zones and port facilities reduces some barriers, yet the conversion chain remains capital-heavy. Each additional subsystem improves export readiness but also increases fixed costs that must be recovered through high utilization. This creates an early tension. Export projects want redundancy to ensure reliability, but redundancy erodes economics if volumes are insufficient. The choice to ship ammonia rather than pure hydrogen reflects this trade-off. Ammonia is easier to store, easier to transport, and already embedded in global trade. Existing vessels, terminals, and handling procedures lower barriers to entry. Yet ammonia adds conversion losses on both ends of the chain. Hydrogen must be synthesized into ammonia before export, and either cracked back into hydrogen or used directly in downstream processes. Each step consumes energy, time, and capital. The system therefore shifts risk from transport to reconversion. Europe and the United States may receive molecules reliably, but the delivered cost depends on how efficiently they can be integrated into local industrial systems. This is where system collisions become visible. Europe's hydrogen strategy assumes large volumes of imported green molecules will arrive to decarbonize steel, chemicals, and heavy industry. But Europe's industrial base is spatially distributed, regulated, and energy-intensive. Import terminals do not automatically align with consumption centers. Pipelines, storage, and reconversion assets must be built, permitted, and financed. If downstream infrastructure lags, imported ammonia risks bottlenecking at ports, forcing off-takers to absorb cost without realizing decarbonization benefits. The export system may function, but the demand system may not be ready to receive it. The United States presents a different collision. With abundant domestic renewable resources and generous production incentives, U.S. hydrogen economics increasingly favor local production. Imports from Egypt are therefore less about volume and more about optionality. They test whether international supply can complement domestic hubs, hedge regional constraints, or support coastal industrial clusters. For Egypt, this means U.S. exports are unlikely to anchor early project economics. They are strategic signals rather than volume guarantees. Bankability will still depend on long-term contracts anchored in Europe or other nearby markets. Time adds another layer of stress. In the 2030 timeframe, early exports will remain limited in scale and supported by policy frameworks willing to absorb higher costs. Utilization may be uneven. Cost per kilogram will likely exceed long-term targets. By 2035, the system faces a fork. If infrastructure scales in parallel on both sides of the corridor, Egypt's projects could approach competitive export economics, especially for ammonia-based applications. If not, fixed costs will dominate, eroding margins and deterring follow-on investment. By 2050, the winners will be those systems that achieved not only low production costs, but also stable logistics, predictable regulation, and resilient demand. Bankability sits at the center of this timeline. Lenders do not finance narratives, they finance cash flows. For Egypt's green hydrogen exports to attract sustained capital, three conditions must converge. First, power supply must be demonstrably reliable at scale, not just on paper. Second, offtake agreements must allocate risk realistically, acknowledging variability, conversion losses, and ramp-up uncertainty. Third, transport and reconversion costs must be transparent and controllable. If any of these elements remain speculative, financing costs rise, and the system loses its advantage. This is where many hydrogen export visions fail quietly. Projects survive technically but underperform economically. They operate below nameplate capacity. They rely on subsidies longer than expected. They struggle to refinance or expand. Egypt's early exports do not guarantee this outcome, but they do expose the path. Success will not come from chasing the lowest possible production cost in isolation. It will come from designing the entire chain to withstand volatility, power fluctuations, shipping delays, regulatory shifts, and market uncertainty. After this stress point, it becomes clear why execution knowledge matters as much as ambition. This is where platforms like H2 Hub by Renewable Energy play a role, not as promotional tools but as execution frameworks. Developers, consultants, and investors navigating hydrogen projects need system-level understanding. How power contracts interact with electrolyzer utilization, how shipping terms affect delivered cost, how financing structures respond to ramp-up risk. H2 Hub is designed as a practical resource for those decisions, focusing on bankability rather than hype. Looking forward, Egypt's position remains conditionally strong. Geography cannot be replicated. Proximity to Europe shortens shipping routes and reduces exposure to fuel costs and emissions. Industrial zones around the Suez Canal offer integration advantages that inland projects lack. But these strengths only translate into durable success if matched with disciplined project design. Overbuilding too early raises costs. Underbuilding limits scale. The system must balance ambition with sequencing. Europe, meanwhile, must confront its own assumptions. Imported hydrogen is not a silver bullet. It is a component in a broader decarbonization system that includes electrification, efficiency, and demand reduction. If Europe overestimates how quickly imported molecules can displace fossil fuels, it risks locking in expensive infrastructure that underdelivers. Egypt's exports are a valuable test case precisely because they reveal these constraints in real time. The United States watches from a different vantage point. Its hydrogen strategy is still forming, shaped by incentives, domestic politics, and regional resource differences. Imports from Egypt may remain marginal, but they provide a benchmark. If imported molecules cannot compete even with generous incentives abroad, domestic projects will face similar scrutiny. In that sense, Egypt's exports inform global hydrogen economics beyond their immediate volumes. The deeper lesson is that hydrogen is not a single technology story. It is a system story. Every link from electrons to molecules to ships to industrial furnaces must align. Egypt has taken a meaningful step by proving that export is physically possible. The next steps will determine whether it is economically repeatable. The system that decides who wins is already at work, rewarding designs that prioritize integration, resilience, and realism. For practitioners building or evaluating hydrogen and related energy projects, Renee Energy's approved project finance and planning models, covering green hydrogen, green ammonia, renewable power, storage, and adjacent clean energy systems, can serve as execution references when stress testing assumptions and cash flows.